The river shimmered like liquid silver beneath the fading sun, its song weaving through the canyon as though carrying secrets too old for men to hear. Somewhere in its depths lingered a hush that felt almost holy, a silence broken only by the splash of a young woman's steps as she moved deeper into the cool water. She had come seeking quiet, seeking to wash away the weight of dust, noise, and the endless eyes that demanded her strength. The canyon seemed to embrace her, a sanctuary where she could lay down her burden and simply exist. But serenity is a fragile thing, and it shattered in an instant when laughter cut through the air, sharp, mocking, cruel. From the brush emerged shadows, rough settlers, whose grins twisted with the delight of malice. Their boots trampled the earth, their voices hooted like jackals, and before she could shield herself, her garments were torn away. The sound of their laughter echoed against the canyon walls, each note a thorn pressed deeper into her skin. She pressed her arms against her chest, the river clinging to her like glass, her dark eyes flashing with fury and shame. The feathers in her earrings dripped as though carrying her humiliation, her breath shallow but alive with fire. She was Apache, daughter of mountains, of storms, of Earth's enduring spirit, and she knew hardship well. Yet this humiliation struck deeper than hunger, deeper than raids or exile. It was a wound to her dignity, a theft of her womanhood in front of the silent cliffs. Her heart throbbed not only with rage, but with a vow whispered into the current. This insult would not be forgotten. The settlers vanished as swiftly as they had come, their cruel laughter fading with the wind, leaving only silence and the trembling of her hands. Alone, bare, unarmed, she crouched in the water, the canyon's shadows wrapping around her like thin, cold blankets. She could not chase them, she could not fight them. Yet in her chest burned something fiercer than despair, the raw ember of defiance. Her spirit had been bruised, but it had not broken. Then, beneath the cry of a distant hawk, another sound rose. Hoofbeats, slow, steady, like thunder rolling far across the plains. She froze, sinking deeper into the water, as though the river itself might conceal her. The hooves grew louder, each step echoing against the stone, until a figure emerged on the bank. A cowboy, tall in the fading light, his silhouette carved against the sky. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, a rifle slung across his back, and the weight of a revolver rested at his hip. He looked like every story of violence her people had ever told, yet something in his stillness carried neither mockery nor threat. In his hand he held a coat, weathered and dust-stained, but offered not as a trophy, offered as a shield. The moment hung between them, suspended like the sun's last ray on the canyon rim. She wanted to turn her gaze away, to reject the image of a cowboy standing at the water's edge, but her eyes betrayed her and lingered on his steady stance. There was no hunger in his gaze, no delight in her shame, only a quiet acknowledgment, as if he understood the depth of what had been stolen from her. The canyon breathed with them, the air thick with things unspoken, and in that silence something fragile stirred, something that hinted that fate was weaving their paths into one thread. Her humiliation was still raw, her anger still burning, yet in the stranger's presence she felt not pity, but the faint whisper of dignity restored. She gripped the water tighter, torn between mistrust and the aching need to be seen without ridicule. A part of her heart longed to push him away, to cling only to her fire, but another part, buried deep and quiet as dawn, felt the first fragile trace of healing. And so the river carried her forward into a new beginning, one she did not yet choose, but one that chose her in the form of a cowboy's shadow. As her breath steadied and the weight of her shame shifted, the world seemed to lean closer, as if it too awaited her decision. If this story has begun to stir something within you, if its current flows gently into your heart like the healing murmur of a river, I invite you to journey deeper with me. Let your voice be part of this canyon. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, let your heart resonate with these words. If you feel the warmth of this tale, like a flame easing the night, then carry it further. Like and subscribe so our paths may continue to cross in this wide, untamed wilderness of stories. Because every echo, every gesture of support is not just for me, it is for the flame of stories that heal, uplift, and remind us that even in the harshest deserts, love can bloom. The hoofbeats still linger in the air, and the cowboy waits at the river's edge. The canyon has only just begun to whisper their tale, and the next chapter lies ahead, heavy with promise, justice, and the unexpected bond of two souls destined to collide beneath the endless sky. The coat weighed heavy in her hands, rough against her damp skin, but it was not the fabric that carried the weight. It was the unspoken meaning stitched into its seams. To her, every thread whispered a contradiction. A cowboy, the very figure she had been taught to mistrust, had offered her shelter without demand. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it close, the smell of dust and leather wrapping around her like an embrace from a world she had always considered an enemy. The fabric scratched her shoulders, yet within its weight she found a strange form of healing, as though dignity could be borrowed, even for a moment, from the kindness of a stranger. The man stood at the riverbank, his posture steady, his gaze turned slightly aside so she could cloak herself in privacy. It was a gesture so simple, yet it pierced her heart more deeply than she wished to admit. He could have stared, he could have mocked. Instead, he offered silence, a silence that honored her. As she wrapped herself, the shame that had burned like fire in her chest began to cool, replaced by a steady warmth she had not felt since childhood. For the first time since the cruel laughter had stripped her bare, she felt not like prey, but like a woman who still carried her strength, hidden beneath her wounds. When she finally stepped from the river, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. Water dripped from her hair, glimmering in the last light, her chin lifted as though daring the world to look upon her again. The coat hung loose, a poor fit, yet on her it became armor. She met the cowboy's eyes at last, and for a heartbeat the air between them pulsed with something unsaid. His gaze was not soft, not pleading. It was steady, carved from the same stone that shaped the canyon walls. "They stole my clothes," she said, her voice low, but edged with steel. It was not a plea, not a confession, but a declaration. Her words carried the fire of a woman who had been wronged and refused to bow beneath the weight of humiliation. The man's jaw tightened, and he gave a single nod, as though he had expected nothing less from a world that too often thrived on cruelty. "I reckon you've been wronged by men who know nothing of honor," he said. His tone was calm, unhurried, like a river cutting stone, inevitable, patient, enduring. "If you'll allow, I'll see to it they don't trouble you again." The offer landed between them like a stone dropped into water, rippling out with meanings too complex to name. She bristled instantly, her shoulders squared beneath the coat. "I do not need saving. I need respect." The words left her mouth sharper than she intended, but truth has a way of cutting clean. Her heart pounded, torn between mistrust and the reluctant recognition that he had spoken not with dominance, but with something closer to promise. His eyes softened, though the set of his jaw remained firm. "Respect is earned," he replied, "but it's also defended. No one earns the right to strip it away from you." The canyon swallowed his words, carrying them into silence. She stood still, her breath caught in her throat, because in those few syllables she heard something unfamiliar. Not pity, not condescension, but a recognition of her strength. It was as though he had placed a mirror in front of her, showing her not the humiliation she had suffered, but the fire still burning within her. For the first time since the settlers' laughter had echoed across the canyon, she felt her chest ease. The ember of defiance that had burned within her now glowed with steadier light, fed not by shame, but by the assurance that she was not as alone as she believed. Yet still the weight of mistrust lingered. She had lived too long among stories of cowboys who tore the land and the people apart to surrender easily to the sight of one standing before her. He did not press her, did not demand gratitude or trust. He simply waited, his presence quiet but firm, like the earth itself beneath their boots. And in that stillness she realized that strength could come not only from solitude and fire, but from the rare hands willing to give without taking. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying with it the smell of dust and sage. She clutched the coat tighter, feeling its warmth seep slowly into her skin, and though she whispered nothing aloud, a silent vow stirred in her heart. She would not forgive those men. But she would not face them alone. Not this time. Her gaze lingered on the cowboy, weighing the risk of letting another's footsteps echo beside hers. In that fragile moment of decision, the canyon seemed to open wider, as though inviting them forward into a path neither had planned, yet both now sensed. A path where humiliation would give way to justice, and mistrust might bend into something gentler, something healing. And so the silence stretched between them, heavy with beginnings. The river's current carried away her shame, leaving only resolve, while the cowboy's steady presence hinted at a bond neither could yet name. The trail ahead waited, marked not by cruelty, but by the first fragile thread of trust, pulling them toward a future neither dared imagine, but both could already feel in the quiet beat of their hearts. The canyon's wind curled around them like a living thing, carrying the faint cries of distant hawks and the rustle of dry grass bowing to the evening air. She stood wrapped in the cowboy's coat, her heart thundering, her spirit torn between fury and a fragile peace that his presence seemed to stitch together. He had spoken of respect as though it were a shield, not a prize, and something inside her, something weary from years of holding fire alone, recognized the truth in his words. Yet she could not yield too easily. Pride was her inheritance, as vital as blood, and she would not let it be mistaken for weakness. "I do not need your saving," she said again, slower this time, though the fire in her voice flickered with the tremor of exhaustion. The canyon walls threw her defiance back to her, magnified, as though the earth itself approved. But within her chest, she knew the edges of that fire had begun to fray. Alone, her rage was sharp, but sharpness dulled quickly when faced with men who carried rifles and laughter sharpened by cruelty. She wanted vengeance, yes, But more than that, she wanted to stand tall, unbroken, unbent. Colton's eyes held hers, steady, unwavering, as though he understood the storm within her. "You don't need saving," he answered, his tone deep and grounded, like soil after rain. "But no one deserves to face wolves alone." His words fell into her like drops of water over stone, gentle yet shaping, smoothing the rough edges of her fury. Something about the way he spoke, not with command, not with arrogance, allowed her to breathe deeper, as if her lungs had forgotten how to hold air until this moment. Her arms tightened around the coat, her body trembling not from cold, but from the weight of choice. Every part of her being had been taught that men like him could only take, never give. Yet here he stood, not reaching for her, not demanding her trust, only waiting with patience rare in the world. It unsettled her, this patience. It whispered of healing, of shared burdens, of dignity restored instead of stolen. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes steadying as they met his. "If you walk beside me, it is not as saviour, it is as equal." The words came with a strength that surprised even her, rising from the bedrock of her soul. She expected resistance, a man's pride bristling at the thought of a woman's demand. But instead, Colton gave the smallest nod, his jaw tightening with something that resembled respect. "That's all I've ever offered," he said quietly. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his revolver, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the weight he carried, and perhaps of the battles that had carved him into the man he was now. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, charged, like the breath of earth before a storm. She studied him, this man of dust and leather, trying to find the flaw in his calm, the trap beneath his stillness. But all she saw was steadiness, a kind of quiet that did not smother, but instead gave room to breathe. Her heartbeat softened, no less fierce but steadier now, as though she had found rhythm in his silence. She realized then that justice was not a road meant to be walked alone. For the first time, she let the ember of trust kindle alongside her fire. The decision shaped itself on her lips before she could stop it. "We ride," she whispered, her voice low, certain. Colton inclined his head once, as though he had known her choice before she did. He turned to his horse, the bay lowering its scarred muzzle as if greeting her with solemn acceptance. She stepped closer, her hand brushing the animal's coarse mane, and for a moment she felt its warmth beneath her palm. The coat still clung to her shoulders, heavy and rough, but now it felt less like borrowed dignity and more like a banner she could carry into battle. The canyon opened before them, a vast stretch of earth waiting beneath the fading sky. Together they mounted side by side, the sound of hooves striking the soil in unison. Behind them lingered the river's current, carrying away humiliation, carrying away shame. Ahead stretched dust and danger, yet within her heart stirred something new, something steadier, warmer, a quiet, healing flame that whispered of trust, of strength shared instead of stolen. And so the trail began, not with surrender, but with partnership. Two souls riding into the unknown, bound by fire, bound by dignity, bound by the fragile beginnings of something neither dared name, but both already felt echoing beneath the endless sky. The night settled over the canyon with a velvet hush, stars spilling across the sky like scattered embers from an unseen fire. Their horses moved in rhythm, hooves pressing into soft earth that carried them deeper into the wild. Between them stretched silence, not heavy but alive, like a thread tying two souls who had not yet spoken all that stirred in their hearts. The moon's light caught on her damp hair, silvering the strands, and Colton found himself glancing at her more than once, though he quickly turned away, respecting the fragile distance she guarded like a blade. Nia held her jaw firm, her gaze steady on the trail ahead, yet within her chest something shifted with each step of the horse beneath her. The weight of shame still clung, but layered over it now was the warmth of unexpected companionship. The man beside her was not of her people, not of her world, yet his presence burned away loneliness as the sun banishes mist. She did not want to admit it aloud, not even to herself, but she felt safer with him riding near, as if the desert itself had chosen this alliance. The trail bent sharply through a narrow pass, the walls of sandstone pressing close, their surfaces glowing faintly under starlight. Here the air grew taut, carrying faint traces of smoke and laughter from ahead. She stiffened instantly, her hands gripping the reins tighter, her heart pounding like a drum. The sound was familiar, the cruel, careless joy of men who believed themselves untouchable. She could almost see them, gathered around their fire, her stolen garments tossed like trophies between their hands. Fury surged hot through her veins, her breath sharp with the ache of humiliation returning. Colton sensed it too. His horse slowed as his hand rose, a quiet signal for patience. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, not with panic, but with a predator's calm. He turned slightly toward her, his voice low and steady, a whisper that felt more like an anchor than a command. "We'll face them on our terms." She wanted to rush forward, to tear back what had been stolen, but the weight of his words rooted her. They were not spoken as an order. They were an offering, a reminder that fury burns brighter when tempered by patience. The healing warmth of his tone cooled the blaze just enough for her to steady her breath. She gave a small nod, her pride bristling at the thought of waiting, yet her spirit recognized the wisdom. They tied the horses to a scrub tree, the animals snorting softly as though sensing the tension in the air. Together they crept forward, their steps quiet on gravel and sand. The firelight ahead flickered against the canyon wall, shadows of men moving in drunken ease. Her stomach knotted, anger and fear twisting together, yet when Colton's hand brushed lightly against her arm, she felt her pulse slow, not from weakness, but from reassurance. He was not here to control her. He was here to walk beside her. The men's voices grew louder as they approached. One of them laughed, holding her dress aloft like a banner, its fabric catching sparks from the firelight. The sight struck her chest like a blade, yet it also fueled her resolve. She was no longer the trembling girl clutching at the river for cover. She was a woman clothed in defiance, and tonight she would reclaim not only her garments, but her dignity. Colton stepped into the fire's glow first, boots grinding against the gravel, revolver drawn but steady, his presence cutting through their laughter like thunder across dry land. The men froze, startled curses spilling into the night. Nia followed, her chin lifted high, her eyes like sharpened obsidian. The fire painted her face in golden shadow, every line of her body speaking not of shame, but of unyielding strength. "That belongs to me," she said, her voice strong, ringing through the canyon as though the earth itself had lent her its echo. The laughter died at once, unease flickering across the men's faces. They had expected helplessness. Instead, they faced a fire that would not be smothered. The one who held her dress sneered, spitting into the dirt as if to reclaim his bravado. "What's it matter?" he began, but his voice faltered when Colton's revolver cocked with a sound sharp as breaking bone. The cowboy's gaze was cold, unrelenting. "Finish that sentence," he warned, his tone deadly calm, "and it'll be your last." The night itself seemed to hold its breath. The men shifted uneasily, realizing too late that their cruelty had lured them into a reckoning. Nia's fists clenched at her sides, not in fear, but in triumph's anticipation. The canyon's silence pressed closer, as though it, too, longed to witness what would come next. And in that fragile pause, just before consequence fell, she felt the first true surge of healing. Not the gentle balm of comfort, but the fierce, restorative power of justice about to be reclaimed. The firelight danced in her eyes, and her spirit burned brighter than the flames themselves, ready to step forward into the moment that would forever bind her fate to the cowboy beside her. The flames snapped and spat in the dry canyon air, their glow throwing sharp edges across the settlers' faces, shadows stretching like ghosts on the sandstone walls. The men stood frozen between arrogance and fear, their laughter gone, replaced with the silence of those who suddenly realize they are prey. Colton's revolver glinted in the firelight, steady in his hand, but it was not the weapon alone that held them. It was the presence of the woman beside him, her chin lifted, her eyes dark and burning like embers that would not die. Her gaze locked on the fabric in their grasp, the sight of it cutting deeper than any insult. Each thread of that dress carried the memory of her body, her dignity, her spirit, and seeing it waved like a trophy set fire to every nerve in her being. She stepped closer, the ground firm beneath her feet, her voice a low command that carried through the canyon. "Throw it!" The men hesitated, shifting uneasily, looking to one another for courage they did not possess. But Colton's revolver did not waver, and Nia's presence beside him was sharper than any blade. With a muttered curse, one of them finally flung the garment into the dirt at her feet. It landed with a thud that echoed louder than gunfire, a sound that seemed to mark the turning of the night. Nia bent slowly, her fingers trembling as she gathered the fabric. But the tremor was not weakness. It was triumph rushing through her veins, fierce and wild. The firelight caught her features as she rose, dress clutched against her chest, her voice carrying like iron struck on stone. "If you ever lay hands on me again, or any woman of my people, the canyon itself will not hide you from what I bring." The words fell upon them like a curse, and for the first time the settlers looked not at a woman they had mocked, but at a storm they had awakened. None of them dared answer. Colton's revolver lowered only slightly, his gaze still fixed on them with the weight of a man who understood justice, not as vengeance, but as balance restored. His silence was more dangerous than any threat, and they knew it. The fire hissed as a breeze swept through, scattering sparks into the night sky. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Colton's voice, calm and cold, broke the stillness. "Best you ride out of this land. You've burned your welcome." His words were not a suggestion, but a verdict, final as stone. The men's bravado crumbled, their shoulders sagging as they stumbled back from the fire, muttering curses that carried no power anymore, They mounted their horses quickly, their retreat clumsy, and the sound of hooves soon faded into the desert, swallowed by the vastness of night. Only when silence settled again did Colton holster his revolver. He did not look at Nia immediately, did not steal from her the moment that was hers to claim. She stood tall in the glow of the fire, her reclaimed garments clutched in her hands, her breath deep and steady, her spirit unbroken. The coat still wrapped her shoulders, a rough shield that had carried her through shame into defiance, but now it rested like armor for a warrior who had taken back what was hers. Her eyes softened, not with weakness, but with the release of a burden she had carried since the settler's laughter first tore into her. She turned toward him, her voice quieter now, stripped of anger, yet full of strength. "You didn't have to stand with me." He met her gaze, his expression unchanged, steady as ever. "No," he said, his voice low and sure, "but no man should stand against you either." The firelight flickered between them, casting their shadows long and entwined across the canyon floor. She held her dress tighter, but her other hand rested against the coat at her shoulders, feeling its weight not as borrowed kindness anymore, but as part of her own strength. And for the first time in many moons, she felt something beyond survival, something fragile, yet real, like the healing warmth of dawn after a night of storms. Side by side, they turned from the campfire and walked back to their horses. The canyon opened wide before them, the desert stretching vast and infinite beneath the stars. She mounted carefully, the coat still close, while Colton swung easily into the saddle. Together, without another glance behind, they rode into the night, the river's song fading, the promise of a new horizon beckoning. As the trail carried them forward, Nia felt the heaviness in her chest give way to something gentler, a rhythm of trust that pulsed quietly between each hoofbeat. She had fought, she had spoken, she had reclaimed herself. And beside her rode the man who had not stolen her fire, but helped it burn brighter. The desert air was cool against her skin, the stars bright above, and for the first time in so long she allowed herself to believe that healing could ride beside her. That dignity could live not only in solitude, but in the bond of two souls, bound by justice and the quiet beginning of love. The desert stretched wide before them, a sea of silver sand and shadow, where the moon poured its light across the earth as if blessing their passage. The canyon behind them had surrendered its echoes, leaving only the sound of hooves striking a steady rhythm, like the beat of two hearts learning to move together. Nia sat straight in the saddle, her reclaimed dress folded carefully across her lap, yet the coat still clung to her shoulders. She could not bring herself to cast it aside. It was no longer only his coat. It had become a bridge, a shield, a quiet reminder that dignity once lost could be guarded again. Colton rode beside her, silent but not distant. His presence was as grounding as the steady pull of the earth, as though he carried storms and suns alike in the stillness of his body. She could feel the weight of his gaze sometimes drifting toward her, though he turned away when her eyes flickered in his direction. Respect lingered in every gesture, unspoken, yet undeniable. She had known men who sought power through domination, who turned women's suffering into laughter. Yet this cowboy carried strength differently. His strength was not in taking, but in holding space, in waiting, in offering his steadiness like a wellspring one could lean upon without fear of being consumed. The silence between them deepened, but it was not empty. It hummed with things unspoken, like the air before dawn, when the sky waits for light. Her thoughts drifted back to the fire, to the way those men's laughter had died in their throats, to the way her own voice had rung out clear and commanding. She had faced them not as prey, not as victim, but as storm. She carried that memory now with pride, but also with an ache that trembled through her, because though she had triumphed, the wound of their cruelty had not yet fully closed. Healing does not come in an instant, no matter how sharp the victory. Her eyes softened as she looked toward Colton. There was no denying it now. His steadiness had carried her through that moment, not by seizing her fight from her hands, but by standing with her until her own fire could blaze brighter. It unsettled her, this sharing of strength. She had lived too long believing she must guard herself alone. Yet here, in the vast desert night, she felt the quiet possibility that perhaps strength was not diminished when shared. It was multiplied. Colton's voice broke the silence, gentle, almost hesitant. "What should I call you?" The question lingered between them, softer than the night breeze, carrying with it a weight far deeper than it seemed. Names were not taken, they were gifts, pieces of the soul entrusted into another's keeping. She hesitated, her lips parting but no sound leaving, the vulnerability of offering her name heavier than any battle. Finally, she whispered, "Nia." The syllables slipped into the night like the river's own song, soft yet eternal. Colton repeated it once, carefully, as though engraving it into his memory. The way he spoke it sent a ripple through her chest, a warmth that eased the sharp edges of her mistrust. He had not asked with entitlement. He had waited until the moment carried trust enough to offer it freely. That patience, rare, tender, was its own form of healing. The trail bent through a narrow rise, the cliffs looming close. Their shadows pressed heavy, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the abandoned camp. Nia's heart quickened, not from fear, but from awareness. The world would not yield easily to the bond forming between her and the cowboy. Already she could feel the resistance of history, of bloodlines, of griefs too deep to be erased by one night's justice. Yet the bond existed, undeniable as the stars that watched from above, fragile but persistent. She breathed deeply, the desert air cool in her lungs, and found within herself a peace she had not known in years. Perhaps she could carry both pride and trust, both solitude and companionship, without losing herself. The thought was delicate, like dawn's first light, but it warmed her spirit all the same. As the horses carried them onward, the night unfolded around them, vast and infinite. Nia's heart began to quiet, not with surrender, but with balance. She realized then that the river had not only washed her skin clean, but had begun to cleanse something deeper. The heaviness in her chest, the loneliness that had shadowed her for so long. And with every step forward, as Colton rode steady at her side, she felt her fire no longer burning alone. It glowed now with the warmth of a shared flame, a healing light to guide them both into whatever trials the desert still held. The horizon stretched before them, promising more than danger. It promised a bond growing stronger, one heartbeat, one hoofbeat at a time. The dawn came slowly, the sky unfurling in soft strokes of rose and gold across the desert horizon, each color spilling into the next like a healing balm poured over the wounds of the night. The horses moved with steady breath, their shadows stretching long over the sand, while the air carried the crisp fragrance of sage and dew. Nia lifted her face toward the light, her dark hair rippling with the breeze, her eyes steady but softened by the quiet beauty that bloomed around them. She had not slept, but she did not feel weary. Something inside her had shifted, as though the earth itself had pressed its hand to her chest and whispered that she was no longer walking alone. Colton rode beside her, his silhouette cut sharp against the morning. His hat brim shaded his eyes, but she could see the faint curve of his jaw, the lines etched by years of weather and survival. He had spoken little since the night, yet his silence was not heavy. It was a steady presence, an assurance woven into the rhythm of hoofbeats. She felt his gaze sometimes drifting toward her, but he never held it long enough to break the fragile trust they had begun to build. Instead, he let her carry her thoughts, his patience wrapping around her like another form of protection. The canyon walls eventually widened, giving way to an open stretch of desert where the world seemed endless. Here, the horizon breathed in all directions, infinite and wild. Nia felt the urge to race across it, to cast away the weight of everything stolen from her, but she held steady, her pride keeping her posture tall. Yet within, the first roots of peace were pushing through the soil of her spirit, small but real. It startled her, this feeling of warmth growing where once only fire and anger had lived. Colton finally broke the silence, his voice low, carrying like gravel softened by rain. "You held them in that firelight," he said. "Not me. You." The words sank into her like the dawn itself, gentle but undeniable. She glanced at him, searching his face for mockery, for any trace of diminishing her strength, but there was none. His eyes were calm, unwavering, and in them she saw nothing but respect. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but with something far more fragile. She had stood before men who took pride in stripping women of their voice, of their power. But Colton had done the opposite. He had carved space for her voice to rise until it filled the canyon. He had not claimed her victory as his own. He had let it belong entirely to her. The realization pressed warmth into her veins, a warmth that eased the ache of humiliation, turning it into something softer, something closer to healing. "You stood with me," she murmured, the admission slipping past her pride like a river cutting stone. "When others would have laughed, you stood with me." Her voice trembled slightly, though her chin remained high. It was not weakness. It was the weight of truth finally spoken. Colton gave a single nod, as though such things needed no grand words. "That's all a man ought to do." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any oath. For so long she had carried her battles alone, believing the world offered only cruelty or silence. But here was a man who did not need to cloak himself in grand promises. His steadiness was enough. His presence was enough. And in that quiet, she felt her spirit stretch, as though making space for something new, something that looked like trust, and perhaps even the faint beginnings of love. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, spilling light over their path. Birds rose from the scrub, their wings flashing silver, and Nia watched them with a soft ache in her chest. She had been caged by shame, bound by fury, but now the cage had begun to crack, and the sky was opening. She glanced toward Colton again, this time letting her gaze linger. He rode with ease, his hands steady on the reins, his posture relaxed yet ready, as though the land itself recognized him as part of its endless rhythm. Her heart beat with a strange mixture of pride and yearning. She had told herself again and again that cowboys were not to be trusted, that their boots carried only greed, their hands only destruction. Yet this one had given her back something she had believed lost forever. It unsettled her to admit it, even in silence, but she could not deny the truth. She felt safer with him than she had felt in many moons. The trail bent once more, leading them toward the open desert where the horizon shimmered with promise. And in that vast expanse she felt not only her own fire burning, but another flame beside it, steady and enduring. The two fires did not smother one another. They glowed brighter together, casting warmth enough to light the path ahead. The day stretched before them, unknown and infinite, yet Nia no longer felt the sting of solitude. She carried within her not only the pride of her people, not only the fury of injustice, but the fragile, healing bond of a companionship that had been born in shame and fire, yet was blossoming into something far stronger. The desert winds curled around them, carrying the promise of trials still to come, but also the quiet certainty that neither would ride those trials alone. The day ripened into gold, and the desert opened wide like an endless canvas, the horizon painted with fire and light. Nia rode close to Colton, the wind tugging at her hair, her reclaimed dress folded carefully beneath the weight of the cowboy's coat that still clung to her shoulders. It no longer felt like a borrowed garment. It felt like a promise, rough, heavy, imperfect, but real. She breathed deeply, letting the desert air fill her chest, and for the first time in countless moons, she felt her spirit loosening, like soil breaking open for new roots to grow. The memory of the settlers' cruelty lingered like smoke, but it no longer poisoned her. Instead, it fueled her, shaping her resolve into something sharp but also healing. She had spoken. She had fought, she had taken back what was hers, and she had done it with a fire no one could extinguish. Yet what startled her most was the presence of the man who had not overshadowed her, who had not tried to turn her pain into a conquest, but who had walked beside her until her own strength carried her forward. That steadiness had become something she did not know she needed until it was offered. As they rode, silence wrapped them like a soft blanket, and in that silence grew a bond woven of respect and something deeper, something unspoken that hummed beneath each heartbeat. Nia's eyes drifted to Colton, tracing the weathered lines of his face, the way the light kissed the brim of his hat, the unshakable calm that seemed carved into his very bones. There was no greed in him, no hunger for dominance, only a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty and chosen, somehow, to stand against it. Her heart softened with the realization that love could grow even here, in a land scarred by dust and blood. It was not the fragile, fleeting love of stories whispered by firelight. It was something slower, stronger, a current beneath the river's surface. It was born of defiance, of trust earned step by step, of healing found not in solitude, but in the shared fire of two souls who carried one another's burdens without stealing them. They stopped at a ridge as the sun began to sink, painting the desert in copper and crimson. Below stretched the world in all its vastness, the land breathing beneath them. Nia closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fading light seep into her skin. For the first time since the settlers' laughter had broken her, she smiled. Not a smile of defense, not one carved to hide pain, but a smile free and true, like a flower opening after rain. Colton glanced at her then, and their eyes met, unguarded. No words passed between them, but none were needed. The silence spoke for them, rich with everything unspoken, gratitude, respect, and the fragile, undeniable stirrings of love. In that moment, Nia understood that their paths were no longer separate threads. They had been braided together by fate, by fire, by the quiet strength of choosing one another when the world would have driven them apart. The desert wind rose gently, carrying with it the scent of sage and the sound of distant wings. She pressed her hand against the coat at her shoulders, holding it close, and felt not only its weight, but the warmth of the man who had given it. Healing bloomed deeper inside her, not as a sudden miracle, but as a slow, steady fire that promised to burn through the nights to come. As the stars began to spill across the sky, Nia turned her gaze toward the horizon, her spirit no longer bowed by shame or solitude. She felt whole, scarred but strong, broken yet mended. And in that wholeness she sensed the beginning of a love that would carry her further than the canyon, further than vengeance, further than fear. Together they rode, not into an ending, but into a beginning that stretched as vast as the desert sky. And if this story has touched even a small part of your heart, if you have felt the warmth of its fire or the quiet healing of its river, I invite you to let your voice join the journey. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, let these words echo beyond the page. If the bond between Nia and Colton has brought you light in the dark or comfort in the storm, I welcome you to like, to subscribe, to walk with me into the next horizon. Because every heartbeat of support is not just for me. It keeps alive the flame of stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that even in the harshest deserts, love can bloom eternal.